Hillary McBride, welcome back to the Gravity Commons podcast.
It's so good to be with you again. Thank you for welcoming me.
Yes, in the intro, we talked a little bit about all the things you get up to, and one of them is one of them is your podcast, Holy/Hurt. And I wonder if you could just talk a bit about that podcast and how it's related to this book with the same title.
Holy Heart, the podcast, was the place that I first wanted to work out some of these ideas. And unlike other kinds of podcasts like yours, where there's ongoing seasons, it was meant to be a limited release resource for people, a free resource that people could turn to when they're asking questions about spiritual trauma and making sense of them. And I thought to do that primarily because podcast production release usually is shorter than publishing a book, right? So then there's that like urgency inside to I gotta get this out. These things need to be shared. Then that felt like the right way to do it. And in the process, I realized how much more I needed to look at inside of myself. It was not as simple as I have these ideas, I'm ready to share them. It became a lot more complicated because it made me touch in on the places inside of myself that have spiritual trauma. So there's the relationship between the podcast and the book are overlapping, and there's new material and different ways of presenting things, and like I would say newer research and some more adaptations on theories and things like that. But the heart of it is the same, which is that spiritual trauma is real, it exists, it impacts us, it lives in our bodies, and that more of us might be connected to the topic than we might have initially thought at first.
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned in your book that as a therapist, you specialize in trauma, and it sounds like that's not accidental. That was personal and probably professional for you. That's like how the focus came to be. I wonder if maybe you could just help ground our conversation in sharing like the language by giving us a brief definition or description of what you mean by spiritual trauma.
Yes, of course. I was hoping you would ask. And it's amazing how that the words spiritual trauma are making their way into our colloquial definitions and the way that we speak about our religious experiences. And yet, what do we actually mean by that?
Right.
It seems like it's kind of hard to wrap our arms around. So I'm going to pull from a definition that I really like by Michelle Panchuk in talking about this. But first, I could give you two kind of broad categories of spiritual trauma. The first one is trauma that happens in or is justified by religious or spiritual people or contexts. So it's trauma that happens in a way that's very easy to associate with religion or spirituality because it's within the walls of the church. The faith leaders were present, doctrine was used, and it kind of hangs out in spaces that we see or relationships that we know as being spiritual or religious. There's another category of spiritual trauma, which is any kind of trauma that impacts us spiritually or religiously. And when I think about widening the scope of this conversation to talk about trauma more generally, I'm impacted by some of the early scholarship on trauma, some of the scholarship that transcends maybe like the definitions of trauma, which are limited to our biology, which highlight the way that trauma is always existential. It's always spiritual. It always ruptures something at the level of the soul. And that's a car accident, that's an assault, that's an act of God, earthquake, a drowning, right? The things that happen to us that trespass our ability to cope and overwhelm us, and make us face something of our own death, or a part of us has to die in a way to survive, that there is no way that the soul is not touched by that. There's no way that the essence of our spirituality is not impacted by injuries of that nature, even if they're outside of the walls of a church or outside of the walls of a spiritual community. So those are kind of the two categories, I would say, of understanding, like, what are we talking about when we're talking about spiritual trauma? The definition that Michelle Panchuk gives, that I'll give to you here, feels like it just thickens that. It just gives some more details. So trauma that's caused by someone closely associated with religion, is inflicted by somebody who's a stand-in for the divine, is justified by spiritual beliefs or practices, or happens because of spiritual beliefs or practices. So that's the first category. The second category is survivors believe that spirituality or religion is somehow the cause. which is
Mm.
kind of what I'd mentioned earlier, that
Yeah.
maybe it doesn't happen inside the context of religion, but our lens, our meaning making lens is such that we assume there's a religious divine component to this. And then lastly, trauma responses are connected to God or religion or spirituality in some way.
Mm.
To that, I mean, the definition becomes broad enough that we can kind of, again, back to what I was saying, ask what trauma is not spiritual trauma.
Yeah.
And how, right? What kind of relational injuries are we not also experiencing as part of the stand-in for the divine? Like if all relationship is part of our web of spiritual connection, then when have we been traumatized by people and it doesn't feel like it's also connected to our larger meaning making story of how we fit into the family of things? So I hope that gives you a definition to work with, but it also kind of like pulls in a bunch of other stuff. Like, oh, okay, there's all these other things involved now too.
Yeah. I mean, makes me go, oh gosh, like Ben and Matt and I are all pastors. We all represent, like, in a sense.
Mhm.
And then I think, like, what we say, what we do, how we act, how we react. Like, there's just so many opportunities
Mhm.
for trauma. And I don't mean like we're intentionally doing that. I just mean like
Mhm.
we are flawed people. And then, I don't know.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. To your point, Christy, like so, Christy, you know this, but Hillary, Ben and I are Episcopal priests, and we have a prayer book. We have prayers we pray regularly, and once in a while, I'll be praying or listening to prayer, and my mind will ping off of the prayer to a person who I also know prays these prayers, who has caused me harm.
Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
and so then my trauma isn't about God, really. It's not strictly about God. It's about how these prayers remind me or are said by people who violate them,
Mhm.
or are not living with integrity to the purpose of the prayer. And so
Mhm.
there's like this collateral damage from my relationships that shows up in my prayer life. And I think that's
Yeah.
what you're describing too.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting point. Your comment, like, I don't know if it's about God and you did this.
Yeah,
I
right,
don't know
right.
if any of this is about actual God. Maybe, like, maybe this warrants a conversation about what are we saying, right, when we're talking about God. But in terms of my understanding, this is so much about how we hurt each other as people, and then how we use our pain, our defenses against our pain, our management or mismanagement of our pain, and wrap that in spiritual language in a way that becomes weaponized and injures other people. And it becomes a very, very important and very tricky thing here to parse out what are our defensive strategies against our own pain, and what is the truth about our spiritual practices that anchor us in what is right and good and helps us live in a good way. And spiritual bypassing feels like a really important thing to bring into the conversation here, that for many of us, our management or mismanagement of our own pain has been to turn to spiritual practices, doctrine, quips and quotes, and scriptural passages that we use to take us away from what hurts inside, and often then maybe encourage other people to do the same thing.
Yeah. The which is it's a subtle difference, isn't it, between that sort of using scripture and spiritual practices to avoid pain and the ways that spiritual practices can be employed to help heal, right? Even when they're, a little bit uncomfortable. And so I don't know. That's I guess the difference that struck me. How maybe one question for you then, Hillary, is how would we know if we're spiritually bypassing?
Sure.
Is there
Yeah.
is there a rubric? How do we
Yeah,
know?
good question, right? Wouldn't that be nice? And sometimes, like, how do we know at the
What's
time
the
of?
test?
because,
yeah, right. Yeah, hardly ever.
oh my gosh,
Yeah.
right? When we're doing it, how often do we know what we're actually doing at the time that we're doing it? It's one of the challenges of being human, isn't it? But the definition by John Welwood, I think it's published. It was first published in 1981. He was the creator of the term spiritual bypassing and was in a Buddhist community and was talking about the way that we, as people, might grab onto spiritual practices to avoid being with and feeling emotional pain in particular. And so that if we reverse engineer the definition, we might say, could our healthy spirituality be something that turns us towards our pain? Could our healthy spirituality, if not used for bypassing purposes, could it actually put us in touch with what hurts?
Yeah.
And I think that there is, I want to be thoughtful about how I say this. And so I might, what I'm about to say, I might rework it in a moment. But to me, there's something about the work of facing spiritual trauma that feels like a spiritual practice, in the sense that there is a dedication to be with the harm and name the harm that we've experienced, perhaps that we've caused, that exists in our sociocultural context. That to me feels like a fierce kind of holy love that moves and walks towards where the injury is, instead of taking us away from and pretending it isn't there. Yeah. And so the reason why I'm cautious about that is because I really don't want anyone to feel like they're co-opted into a kind of spiritual practice of turning towards their pain. If that, if spirituality has been weaponized against them, I want this to do your work of trauma healing to feel like it comes with agency and self-determination. But when I think about the kind of spirituality that I want to embody, that I want for us as a world, that mends the wounds of colonization, that mends the wounds of patriarchy and misogyny and the isms that fragment us from each other, I think this kind of spirituality that helps us live in a good way demands that we look at where it hurts.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. The agency has to be present, right? For us to be able to do that. But there is, it just strikes me as a spiritual practice, but also an act of faith for someone to take that step of tending to their pain, or the pain that they have caused. Because I think, if my understanding of trauma is correct, it's a life, and you said this earlier, it's a life and death thing. Our bodies believe it's life and death, right? Where there is a fear, then I think ultimately in our bodies, when it comes to facing our pain and our trauma, there's a fear of being destroyed. There's a fear of being like, I'm not going to be okay if I do that. And so it strikes me as a profound act of faith then as well, that there is some sort of divine presence that will hold me, or others that will hold me. If I face this pain, I won't be destroyed. The healing is somewhere in here. I don't really know how it's going to work, but I can face the pain because I'm not, I trust enough that I'm just not going to be destroyed, but I'll be held or sustained somehow in the midst of that.
That's where we get into the definition again, or I'll pull from the definition something that was said about the injuries that happen in relationship with people who are stand-ins for the divine. And who are our earliest stand-ins for the divine, but are usually our family of origin, the people in our community that we're right next to. And so by the time we get to the point of experiencing what we might call a spiritual trauma, or maybe a shock trauma with an index event, something that could, very clearly be agreed upon by multiple people as a horrific, life-threatening event, it is possible that we've already sustained spiritual injuries, spiritual trauma, in having been made to be alone with the earlier experiences of terror and grief that made us feel like, oh, if I can't survive this, how could I survive something even bigger than this?
Right. Yes.
That there's a likely an imprint or a memory living inside of us of having been made to be alone with something that was very, very, very terrifying. And when we actually take this from a hypothetical conversation into into the research literature, the empirical literature about outcomes related to trauma and what happens on a nervous system level as it relates to relational response, there was a really well-known paper that was published in 2017 called The Social Model of Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. And essentially what the authors were able to prove through their empirical analysis was that when people have been met with the response of being seen and known and held and validated and understood and treasured on the other side of big, really scary stuff, that their nervous system gets the proof that they survived and it's over.
Yeah.
So it's actually in the absence of that the thing becomes, it goes on living inside of us. It goes on becoming this unfinished opened wound that's gaping and hasn't closed, which kind of begs the analysis that there's multiple injuries that then happen. Right? There's the thing that happened that hurt us, but then there's also the way that we were not held, not met by love, by community, by family, by parents, by partners, by, the whatever around us that holds us. And it's the incident and then the not being met in it that compounds the injury to have it feel overwhelming and unsurvivable.
Yeah.
And again, when we go back to early experiences in development and attachment, we are much more likely to believe we can tell someone about the trauma, and we will be believed and we will be held if we've already had the experience of saying to someone, Mom, I'm so scared. I was overwhelmed. I was terrified. And Mom's there and is like, I'm right here with you. I got you. Show me how scary it was. Can you bring me into how scary it was? I want to feel every bit of it with you. I'm here. You're safe. It shouldn't have happened. I'm with you. We're not going to let that happen again. Like that then is in our body as a possibility. And if that never happened, how on earth do we, with the bigger stuff, believe, oh, someone's going to hold me with this too?
Yeah.
Which is hard then if there's spiritual trauma that's happened, at least in many communities. If somebody's brave enough to actually say something, a lot of times it seems like it's silenced.
Yeah.
People are like, you're crazy, that's not true, you're sinning, whatever the thing is, by even bringing it to the light, which then adds more trauma to an already very painful thing.
Yeah, you were just describing that little scene. My brain filled in faces and places as you described that scene, Hillary, of bringing healing medicine to our nervous systems. I wonder what words you would put to that. It's at the very least there's attunement and empathy and connection, having a resonating witness. But I wonder if you can maybe fill that out for us more. How do we become how do we become medicine for other people when their nervous systems are reactive?
The most profound thing I have ever done to impact the way that I show up for other people and their pain is to look at my own without any hesitation. Because when I have gone right to the bottom of the things that are excruciating, unbearable, overwhelming, and been accompanied in that way, and it has been survivable, it has made me not afraid of any feeling, of any story, of any intensity. Like I can look at you unshakably and say, there's nothing inside of you, no pain that scares me. And it's because I have felt it all. I felt it all. I felt it all. And will keep feeling it all over and over and over again inside of myself. So when I think about how do we become people who bring that medicine, I don't know if there's a way to do that well and actually feel that sturdy, rock solid, fiercely loving capacity if we haven't looked at it inside of ourselves, or if we haven't been willing to, maybe is another piece.
Yeah.
So there's that. And then I think on top of that, the skill of slowing down, of being connected to our bodies, of knowing we're allowed to have limits and that we can care for people but not abandon ourselves. I think the things that I do in therapy with my patients have become more and more and more the things that I do with my loved ones that they do with me, where we say, right, can I be with you and how big this is? Can you show me how awful it was? Can you take me to the worst part? Here's what I wish I could have done if I was in that moment. Could we imagine that now together? Not to suggest that people have to become trauma therapists. In fact, it's very, wise and judicious to know like where you're not needed and where it's not appropriate for you to go. But really for us to be humans who are brave to say, can you tell me what that was like for you? I think when we can be brave, we can trust that the loving, patient parts of our heart will come with us to hold a space around how big the pain is, how big the fear is.
Yeah. This reminds me of your chapter on how we feel. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about that process of like, confronting or facing or befriending pain in our lives and the role of learning how to feel or recovering the grace of feeling our feelings, how that plays a role in that.
Yeah. I think sometimes the place that we start with feeling our feelings is looking for where they're not. It's a really tricky kind of maybe surprising or backwards step. But for many of us who grew up in relational, religious, systemic contexts where the intensity of our feeling and our right to feel it in our bodies and the right to stay connected to our bodies went away in favor of survival, connection, dissociation, repression, good theology, good logic, whatever it was, that the ability to realize there's a lot I haven't felt and I'm not feeling, or the pause to notice, wait, what am I feeling right now? Or this is a really big story, or something big just happened and it feels like there's nothing there. It's almost like that becomes the place that we learn to look for where the feeling could or should be. So looking for the places where it's absent and where it was absent in our life, looking back, like what big thing happened that I felt nothing about? What big thing happened where I wish I could have showed up this way, and yet there was nothing there for me. I think learning to connect to our bodies is it's it, right? Like that's the main thrust of most of my work, because we can't regulate emotions we can't feel. We actually can't feel connected to people if we can't feel. And feeling an emotion is an affective process. It's all body, right? We might have words that we put on it, and there might be stories that are connected to it. But Jaak Pansep, who is an affective neuroscientist, said so beautifully that emotions are ancestral tools for living, that they are evolutionary tools that have supported our life, and they are wired in from the get-go to us, for us, on the level of the body, to help us expand, survive, protect, feel joy. Yeah. So being able to be with the body, I think, is really important. And there's a lot of things in our culture that interfere with that. A lot of the way we've been socialized, but also the pace that we move at. Bodies move at a different speed. Body language, in terms of the tempo of body language, the tempo of body language is different than the tempo of our culture.
Yeah. That's been a profoundly helpful thing for me as well. Just like getting in touch with what my body is feeling and what's happening. And I also recognize that we talk about trauma a lot in our culture these days. And I think that's been really helpful for a lot of people. And one of the ways it's been helpful for me is I was able to associate my avoidance of feelings with perhaps, what you might term like a small t trauma, like a trauma response, like a trauma uh, reaction that I wasn't aware of, that was a reaction to trauma. And so I guess I'm wondering if, I think a lot of our listeners are probably very aware of spiritual trauma in their life. but maybe some others are not as aware. And I wonder if you can name, you have in your book, you have a fairly detailed list of like symptoms of trauma. And I remember, part of my journey has been discovering that things that I thought were just my personality or, just like me, were like, oh, this is actually a symptom of, I'm trying to avoid something here. And it's, there's some trauma aspects to this. So I don't know. I wonder if you can maybe tell us a few symptoms of trauma that are often overlooked or maybe not seen as a trauma response in our culture.
Yeah. I mean, the big one as it relates to this conversation is I'm bad. Like
That inner
having the
thought that
belief,
I'm bad.
yeah, having a belief inside I am bad.
Mm.
And why that's particularly difficult to point out as a symptom of trauma is because for many people in religious contexts, that's seen as right belief.
Right. I
That's
got a
seen as
Bible verse
good,
for
right?
that. Yeah.
Right,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
Praised, celebrated.
Mhm.
I would say that it feels really hard to point out the thing as a symptom of trauma that was celebrated as proof of really mature faith or having become incredibly
Yeah.
compliant and like doing it the right way. So there's that. Another symptom of spiritual trauma that I think people might not notice would be assuming that there's a spiritual reason for the bad things that happen in their lives.
Mhm.
So when there's something that's really difficult that's going on, the family that's trying to have a baby, the kid that can't get in contact with their dad and their dad won't be close to them, the person who has got this illness and this diagnosis around a cancer or something like that, the stories that we tell about it, like this must be proof that I did something bad. This must be proof that I didn't do enough good things in my life. So that what we might call like the spiritual math, the meaning making strategies that we have that imply that the painful things in our life are tied to our missteps, our brokenness.
Yeah.
I think those are two things. And then there's also really interesting, surprising things, like for people who have really, really complicated maybe I'll say like diagnostic profiles around sexual dysfunction. Some people might think, how could my vaginal pain, how could my erectile dysfunction, how could my lack of sexual desire, how could my total body dissociation during a wanted sexual experience be connected to my spirituality at all? And yet we see the link between high demand, high control religious environments and sexual dysfunction, sexual pain. So it's really interesting to start to pull apart all of these pieces. But when bodies are in pain, when bodies are speaking up, even if we can't draw a link to our spiritual community or religious belief, our bodies are always telling the stories of what we've been through. And so it may be interesting, instead of assuming that it's not related, to ask the question, how is the pain inside of me, even my physical pain, connected to a spiritual injury that I endured, that I survived? It's almost like we want to change the question around, instead of looking for like, what are, spiritual trauma like only shows up in this one way and he's got these unique symptoms. Again, if what I was saying earlier is true, that all trauma is spiritual trauma, what happens if we flip the question and say, how could it be that this is also connected to my spiritual history, lineage, and the injury that trespasses my lifespan into intergenerational pain as well?
Yeah.
Well, you go back over and over in your book on how sadness and grief are vital to healing from trauma. And I'm wondering if you can just share a bit of how grieving plays a role in our healing.
There's a term in one of the kinds of therapies that I practice. It comes from the AADP world, called mourning the self. And mourning the self is proof of a transformational state. What mourning the self means is that we have gotten through enough of the pain to the other side, that there's enough certainty in our body that what happened is really over, that we can finally look back and feel the pain that we were not able to feel when we were busy surviving. We dissociated when we had to shove things down. And so grieving is healing. Grieving itself is part of the act of healing, but part of it as well is that it is proof that healing has already taken place, that we can get to the point where we can thaw enough of our survival responses to be with the truth of what we never got. And in doing so, when we grieve, we witness our own pain with the truth and the love that we would have needed at the time that it happened. That's really what our hearts are doing, like breaking on our own behalf for what didn't happen. And in that way, we get to offer to that version of ourselves who survived what they did a true reflection in a way that no other person on the planet can really deeply know how painful it was for us and what we went through. Our hearts break on our own behalf, I think, to witness with the truth and the depth required of the awfulness of what happened.
Yeah. It's so good. We'd be remiss if, as we wind down here, Hillary, not to mention the other voices that you pull into the book. Each chapter has kind of puts your chapter in conversation with another voice that you value. Can you tell us how that came to be part of the format of your book, and maybe highlight one of those voices for us that so people can get a flavor of it?
Yeah. I am so aware that an injury, an impact of spiritual trauma that lives in us as a culture is the myth of individualism, which I think is part of the legacy of colonialism. I think it's part of the legacy of hypercerebrality and androcentrism that's part of patriarchy. And for me, the project would have never been, I could have never done it alone. No big project, no book, no podcast ever happens alone anyway, as you all know. But for me, it felt really important to bring in voices because I think that undoes the myth of aloneness that many of us feel is like the ideal, is the way. And I would just never assume that I would have all of the insight or all the wisdom on these really complex things that are so phenomenological, that are so embodied and so lived. I think one of the voices that comes to mind is Roberto Che Espinoza, who's such an important voice in the trans community, such an important voice in the community of people of color, the Latinx community, as well as faith leader community. As an ordained Baptist minister, he is speaking about things that I only wish that I heard about growing up, and can name with from lived experience, what it's been like to be othered by a community that we all deserve to be a part of. And so Roberto has got some incredible works out there, a couple books out there as well, including, I think his most recent was Body Becoming, all about embodiment. Yeah, the lived experience of being trans, how that relates to culture, faith, all of it. Yeah. So I'd really recommend all of the people in the book have such incredible works and editions and voices, and that's just one that comes to mind.
Well, the book, again, is called Holy Hurt, Understanding Spiritual Trauma and the Process of Healing. Hillary, thanks for taking time to be with us today.
Thank you so much. It felt so good to be with you again. Thanks for everyone for listening.